Evgeny Morozov, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much for coming, and thanks for the introduction. I'm not going to ask you how many of you have read my tweets, which is at this point probably my primary literary output. But I think I'll start with an example that might situate what follows quite well. So those of you who have been to the Philippines in the last few months and who have had a chance to visit the public bathroom there might have noticed something rather odd. The public bathrooms in some of the cities in the Philippines right now feature a sensor whereby the moment you leave the stall in the toilet, an alarm goes off, and that alarm continues ringing until you press the soap dispenser button. Thus, get some soap onto your hands, wash your hands, and thus leave the toilet. The operating principle of the system, to you, of course, I think would be very familiar. It relies on a principle that many of you have come to see and notice in your everyday life, and it's the principle that by monitoring and observing and categorizing and cataloging your behavior, it becomes possible to also intervene in many of the things and activities that you do. Right? Most visibly, this principle is present in your smartphones, but also in many other tracking devices, whether those are wearables, whether those are smart glasses for those of you who have it. The operating principle is the same. We can collect a lot of data about the behavior of individuals in real time. We can analyze it in real time, and in real time we can have some kind of intervention. That intervention can be either in the form of the sound, which is very unlikely, as in the case of that alarm in the toilet in the Philippines, or it can be in the form of some kind of softer nudge that we would see popping up on our phone or on any of the other screens that we see. So the nudge would be purely visual. It's very easy to dismiss this kind of innovation and this kind of thinking as just pure nonsense that comes from small startups, that's just fetishizing of technology and so forth. I would argue that it also represents, however, a very interesting but also very disturbing trend where the primary onus and the primary way of regulating and solving problems does rely on the power of information technology and does rely on the power of sensors and algorithms to regulate the behavior of individuals. And that's a sort of the overall trend I describe as solutionism in my book that came out most recently. And that's a trend that I have been trying to understand both politically, philosophically, and also sociologically. What does an ideology like solutionism presume about politics, about citizens, about political subjects, about the kinds of political change that are possible today, but also what are the roots of its popularity? Why is it that our governments and our institutions are so keen to take on these technological solutions as the default way of addressing some of the problems that we face? And I would argue that this little example from the Philippines, where, by the way, the technology was not provided by some kind of small startup, but was actually delivered by a huge company, Procter & Gamble, that is only a tiny bit in an overall rather huge map of similar changes happening elsewhere. I would argue that we are seeing the same changes in fields as diverse as health, with all sorts of self-tracking tools and devices and platforms that also seek to nudge you, the patient, to do certain things about your health. We see the same trends in energy, where again, your energy consumption habits are monitored, analyzed, and presented to you. We might also see them very soon in the realm of personal finance, where your spending habits will be analyzed, trends identified, and at some point you will actually be informed that you ought not to be spending this extra €2 on a latte because that already goes over your budget. Right? You actually already see that all of that becomes possible once every single act of your everyday behavior is traced, tracked, analyzed, and stored somewhere. So as we move to a world that is fully mediated by digital technology, a world that is mediated by smartphones, a world that is mediated by technologies that have sensors and real-time connectivity, it becomes possible to draw much greater insight about the activities of individuals. Right? And that in itself, sociologically, on the one hand, gets a lot of interest and generates a lot of interest in technology companies who just happen to be running the infrastructure for this problem solving, right? It's the Apples and the Googles of the world that run the hardware and the software through which this software, sensor-based, monitoring-based kind of politics and kind of regulation can be enacted. So these companies are natural cheerleaders for many of these technologies. And it also generates a lot of excitement amongst politicians who like these technologies for a very different reason, namely that it's the kind of low-hanging fruit that allows them to create an illusion and some visibility and some kind of veneer that they actually can still regulate, they can still deliver the kind of acts that we expect of them as politicians, while at the same time controlling just the citizen and not other parts of the system. And this aspect is very important, and that would be, I argue, the sort of the key to understanding my message today. How we choose to tackle a problem, whether we want to tackle it by focusing on the individual, right, whose behavior we can track and monitor very easily, or whether we choose to focus on corporations, lobbyists, other institutional and social forces that might be responsible for the problem we are trying to tackle, that decision in itself is a political decision, right? So it's incorrect to assume that simply because citizens are much easier to track and monitor today, than that we should pursue that option as our default regulatory response to the problems we are facing. Right? That in itself ought to be defended by the people pushing for these agendas. And what I mean by this is the following. If you think about self-tracking tools for health, for example, right, which are often pitched to us as solutions to all sorts of problems like obesity, for example, right? The assumption that is made both by the technologists who are building the tool and by the regulators who are cheerleading for it is that a problem like obesity is primarily caused by certain irrational behavior on behalf of the patient and on behalf of the individual. So the assumption is that the reason why you put on weight is because you cannot properly coordinate your diet or you cannot properly get enough exercise. And all of that now can be monitored through the mobile phone, through the smartphone, because we have sensors in it. And you yourself can be nudged. You can be asked, you can be demanded to actually eat differently, exercise differently, walk differently, right? That assumption, however, goes against much of the excellent scholarship and activist work that was done in the 1970s and 1980s that precisely tried to take disease as something that is purely biomedical and present it as something that is also socio-political, if you will, right? Where the argument is that the decisions that we make about food, about exercise, are not solely under our own control, right? What we eat is partly the result of how much power we grant to the food companies, how much power we grant to the junk food companies when they decide how to regulate on television, how they decide how to cater in school cafeterias, right? So it's the result of the complex lobbying work that they do. It's the result of the various struggles over food labeling, right? It's not just the result of our own autonomous decision as individuals, right? We find ourselves amongst existing ongoing political struggles, and that it was the work of the social movements in critical health, for example, to try to understand what are those social factors that we can also regulate and tinker with in order to arrive at the solution of the problem. It's the same more or less with, if we stick to the problem of health, it's the same with walking, right? If you live in America, right, in some obscure part of California, for example, it would be very hard for you to get enough exercise for the sole reason that there is nowhere to walk because the city or the village is optimized for the car and not for the passerby, right? So, of course, we can be trying to put and shift more and more responsibility on the shoulders of the citizen, telling them that, well, your smartphone suggests that you're not walking enough. Right? But of course, none of that can be fulfilled without major effort on behalf of the individual, which would be easier in more urban settings with actual infrastructure for walking than outside. Right? The reason why I'm saying all this is that you can clearly see how decisions that are about how we ought to regulate and run our society and its various components, be that companies, be that infrastructure, be that physical space, be that food labeling, are suddenly no longer on the table. What's on the table is only what are the best ways through which we can monitor, control, and nudge the individual. right? And that shift from the more social and institutional kind of problem solving to this highly individualistic problem solving that assumes the citizen as its primary target is in itself, I would argue, a dangerous political transformation that we need to be cognizant of amidst all the celebration of innovation and disruption that inevitably comes together with the introduction of all of these technologies. Right? That, of course, is not happening for the reason that our governments, I would argue, have run out of basically time, money, and effort to tame those social and political forces. Right? Our institutions, whether you're thinking about corporations or whether you're thinking about governments, whether you're thinking about think tanks, are becoming the very opposite of citizens. The citizens are becoming more and more transparent, more and more monitorable, more and more nudgeable, more and more governable, while the institutions are becoming the very opposite. They're becoming even more obscure, they're becoming even more harder to monitor, they're becoming even less governable, and they are actually deliberately taking steps to obfuscate many of their activities. Governments are classifying more and more documents. You have governments outsourcing more and more of their activities to the private sector, where basically you cannot actually ask for any information because private companies are not subject in many countries to freedom of information laws. You're also getting big energy companies producing all sorts of research that actually seeks to change established scientific opinion on climate change and thus mislead the public. All of these actors actually deliberately trying to be less transparent, right? And as a result, our politics shifts towards the low-hanging fruit of the system, and the low-hanging fruit of the system is the citizen, right? And this is what I find particularly troubling about the infrastructure for problem solving that we are putting in place, because it ultimately destroys our ability to think in causal terms, right? And it's this focus on causality that I think has traditionally characterized how we thought about politics. Politics in the past used to be about trying to do something about the causes of the problems, right? We try to understand why does a problem like crime exist? Why does a problem like terrorism exist? Why does a problem like climate change exist? Why does a problem like obesity exist? I can continue like that for a very long time, right? Those were the kind of questions we were asking. And we tried to do something about the root causes at the heart of the problem, right? Right now, we are finding ourselves in a very weird form of utopia where we are generating so much data about one particular player in the narrative plot, and that player is the citizen, that we're actually abandoning the questions of causality and just focusing on what we can do about the effects that these problems are causing, right? So, of course, and that's what we're actually measuring when we're measuring the behavior of the citizens. We can measure how much energy we are consuming, we can measure how much exercise we do, we can measure how much food we are eating, we can measure how likely we are to commit crime and how likely we are to commit terror, right? But ultimately, all of those behaviors are not just the result or the product of our own individual decision-making or our own autonomous process of growing up, right? All of them are, in one way or another, shaped by various socio-political and economic factors that lie far outside of our control, right? And it used to be that the subject of politics in itself was all about trying to go and do something about those causal forces. My fear is that that old school politics is no longer on the table, right? And we can talk about the historical and sociological reasons as to why that has happened. You know, I sort of hinted at some of the factors. I do think that it has to do with the way in which governments have just relied far too much on the private sector, and they have kind of abandoned, or they have been captured by the private sector, which is probably an even better way to explain the situation, but that's the reality. So what happens is that, of course, since we are only controlling the effects of the problems and not the causes, the only way to do it at large scale is to monitor everything that happens. That's the only way to identify, preempt, and do something about the effects of the problems. That's why we do have large-scale surveillance of virtually everything, not just things related to terror, but eventually everything connected to health, energy, you name it. Because the idea, again, is not to try to resolve the problem by tracing back how that problem has developed, but try to prevent it and intervene in real time to prevent it from becoming an even bigger problem, right? And you can see that logic at work in many domains, again, where the idea is not to try to come up with a historical narrative and still think in a kind of mode that assumes that there is a historical past and there is a future, and we are not just living in the present moment. But no, the idea now is to assume that we are living in the real time. There is just now, and what we want to do is to regulate what's happening at this particular moment by controlling the behavior of the participants in the system, right? And if that's the kind of politics that we are moving towards, and I would argue that, again, with the proliferation of sensors in the smart home, in the smart car, in how we consume energy, in smart glasses, in virtually everything that we carry and everything that we do, such real-time interventions will become very cheap, very easy, and very tempting not to do. I mean, at this point, you can clearly see how the infrastructure that has been built by Silicon Valley, both in terms of software and hardware, is extremely conducive to that agenda. So, I mean, right now, if you want to go and understand, where is it that Ebola is developing, you would probably be better off looking at how people search for symptoms on Google, right? It would just logically, it makes sense to go and see who is it in the world that is typing, I have a flu, I have a headache, and then try to come up with some kind of a action plan based on that. You don't need to actually develop a more sophisticated model. It's enough to look at the data points and do something about them, right? And the rationale here, again, I think is very interesting. That system is already there. That data is being generated, right? That data is being generated regardless of whether we look at it or not, right? And then it becomes a problem for privacy activists or for people who are concerned about the evaporation of politics from the public realm to argue as to why this data should not be used, right? And Ebola might be an extreme case, but you can easily think how the same kind of rationale will apply to any other domain. I mean, with energy, you can also see how easy it can function. If any device will tell you that, well, perhaps you should unplug it, or you should be spending, or you should be using it differently, or that you're spending more energy than the house next door. Again, it's a nice adjustment of how you function within the system. It does not do anything on a broader scale about how the energy and the electricity system has come into being, how companies are regulated, and so forth. So in a sense, it's a way to buy time, and it's a way to keep the system working by tinkering with the attitudes and the behaviors of its users without doing anything about the actual composition of forces that have created the system in the first place. And for me, it is a very remarkable and powerful, but also a very dangerous undertaking because, again, the disappearance of causality from even how we think about life, and political life especially, is very symptomatic of the overall disappearance of feelings like solidarity and feelings like mutual association or sociality as such, right? It's very hard for us to understand shared grievances, to understand what it is that we owe to each other, to understand how we can engage in collective efforts to change the world, if we cannot even articulate why certain problems exist the way they exist, and we just focus on the effects, right? All sorts of political struggles eventually derive from our ability to tell a story how a given problem has developed. And for me, I think a tool and a paradigm for how Silicon Valley and technology companies in general can present a solution to the problems that we face without addressing any of the root causes behind them would be Google Now, which those of you who use Android phones might have seen or even used. And it's a system, I often use it in my examples, but I think Google Now really is the paradigm of where search is going, but it's also a paradigm of where this real-time, data-intensive kind of algorithmic regulation idea is actually heading as well. So those of you who don't know, Google Now works as follows. It basically tracks everything you do on different Google services. So it tracks what you do in your email. It tracks all of the plane reservations or hotel reservations you have in your email. It tracks what you search for. It tracks your location. It tracks the websites you have visited. It basically tracks the videos you've seen on YouTube. Everything that Google already tracks about you is also available to Google Now. And by analyzing what's happening in your life, Google now, and that's almost a direct quote from its developers, it's seeking to give time back to the users, right? So the idea is that by analyzing at great scale everything that you do, it will be possible to make certain decisions for you, to simplify your life in a certain way by identifying some of the unpleasant hassle and taking it out of your life, and thus giving the time that you would otherwise not have to you so that you can enjoy the things you're actually doing, right? Or you might be doing. So the way it works is that if Google identifies that you have a plane reservation in your email, it will automatically remind you of the flight. It will tell you how much time it will take to get to the airport based on the real-time traffic conditions. It will automatically check you into your flight. It will tell you the weather at the destination where you're going. It will tell you if you're standing right now, right here, that there is a cinema theater, for example, next door, and those films are being shown. It will analyze your email for any mentions of meetings you might be having and remind you of those meetings. It basically does what a secretary would do, right? But it does it not like Siri does for Apple. It does it by analyzing everything about you and then making decisions and making predictions based on that, right? And I think that Google Now is a very interesting product in that you can clearly see that it does not actually demand of you to know anything about the past or about anything really, because the system will contextually provide everything that you need to know at any given time, including probably search. So if you closely follow the rhetorical statements made by some of Google's executives, you can see that they're becoming really excited about what they call autonomous search. And it's the idea that, your smartphone, and Google Now more specifically, will be actually conducting all of the searches that you might be conducting yourself in the background, serving you the relevant information you might need at a particular point in time, so the search itself becomes unnecessary, right? That's the ultimate step in saving time, right? Instead of having you go to the Google search window and type in, show me flights from Amsterdam to Paris, the system will do it on its own and show you those flights because it understands your informational needs, analyzing everything else you've done in the past. That's the idea, right? And this is how it's saving time. And I've been testing it for quite a long time now, and at this point I can assure you that for many tasks it actually works. But the basic idea that you can actually relieve the pressure from users from knowing that they are standing next to a museum, or from knowing that they are standing next to a cinema house, or by knowing anything actually about what has been happening in their life, so what's happening in their life now, it also undermines their ability to come up with any kind of narrative that will explain what it is that they do and how it is that they relate to the world or the culture at large. Because essentially, the only things that you need to know in that system is how to turn it on. That's it, right? The rest is generated automatically based on context. It's generated based on your location, it's generated based on your plans, it's generated based on everything that the system has learned about you so far. And to me, that's actually indicative of the kind of shift towards the real-time politics that, again, has abandoned narrativity, has abandoned causality, and that just exists by perpetually drawing on some kind of feedback loops to make us effectively and efficiently achieve the tasks that we have set for ourselves. In that sense, this system is perfect in that it allows us to take on and tackle an increasingly growing number of tasks that we face. And we are all facing more and more tasks because our lives are becoming more and more complicated, more and more complex. We do not have jobs that last from 9 to 5 anymore. We have to struggle with smaller jobs. It increases the kind of hassle we have in our lives. And Google Now, from that perspective, does allow us to deal with a situation that would otherwise be unmanageable, right? It would require either us feeling burnt out and stressed, or it would require just some of us withdrawing from the participation in the market altogether. So in that way, Google Now is not just indicative of this shift away from temporality and the shift away from causality and narrativity. It's also a very nice illustration of how technology at this point has become something like a magic wand, something like a deus ex machina, which you can bring on stage as a politician or as a society to help you deal with the crisis that might otherwise become unmanageable, right? And I would argue that many of these technological solutions that you see whether it has to do with self-tracking in health, or with tracking in energy, or with this kind of silly nudging tools that I've described that you see in bathrooms and elsewhere, they have to do precisely with the fact that the system and the state has a very difficult time relying on other forms of regulatory action. And that is either for political or economic reasons or solely for the ideological ones, right? Since we are living at a time where, we do operate in a paradigm that I can only describe as neoliberal, where we do not actually believe in ideas like social justice or laws anymore. We cannot actually use those to regulate some of the behavior that would otherwise be regulated by appealing to some kind of decency or by appealing to laws. I mean, all of that is slowly being taken off the table. So the only way in which the system can continue functioning is that if you supplement those with a different paradigm, and that paradigm in our case is the paradigm of technology, where you rely on sensors, internet connectivity, all sorts of schemes like gamification to get citizens to do things that they would have previously done for very different reasons, right? And the fascination that Silicon Valley shows with gamification, for me, is very telling. I mean, those of you who don't know what gamification is, it's basically using the various games and points, currency and rewards, and virtual currencies especially. It can also be reputation on Facebook to compensate people for activities they might not otherwise do on their own will, right? And it has become a big business, and there are a lot of consultants and think tanks going around and preaching gamification as a way to resolve some of the problems that we face. To give you a very simple example, think about you walking down the street somewhere in the middle of a Dutch town, and you see litter lying on the ground, right? And in the past, when we still operated under a somewhat different mental and moral and political paradigm, well, perhaps you would pick up that litter because you thought that that's what good citizenship is all about. You would think that, well, you're living in a city together with other people, and that's what kind of good, normal attitude towards living in the city with others is all about. Or you can think of a somewhat different paradigm where you would rely on laws that would ask everybody who sees litter on the pavement to pick it up. And, of course, it didn't probably happen anywhere, maybe with an exception of countries like Singapore, but that's an alternative paradigm, right? Where you can rely on laws, fines, and kind of threat of legal action to get things done. So you can have morality, you can have law. But what's happening right now is that you have this very bizarre integration of technology on the one hand and then the market form on the other, where your phone would know when you're actually going down to pick up litter. It will know that it's litter, and it can easily reward you with 3 points that at the end of the month you can convert into a free latte and thus be a good citizen and also win something at the end, right? That's the paradigm in which we operate right now. And that's the paradigm that is very easy to implement, given that sites like Facebook have created a way for us to tap into entirely new forms of motivation, because it has been understood that we would do things either to win some kind of emotional, social capital and thus impress our friends, or we would do it because we would actually be rewarded with points that can later be converted into some kind of an actual award. Now, there are very good reasons why such motives and why such programs are taking off right now. They're taking off because I don't think that the other two paradigms are actually defensible. Defensible precisely because of the specificity of the historical time in which we are living. It's indefensible to demand more laws, and it's even more indefensible to expect that people will still operate on a paradigm of sociality where we're continuously being pushed to think in very individualistic terms, rely on the market, and act in our own benefit, right? So with that in mind, you can clearly see that technology at this point does play this role of a savior, right? It's something that allows the political system that we have to preserve the veneer of normalcy and to pretend that everything is okay without ever actually bringing up some of the moral and political implications that are involved in a shift from moral and legal code to the actual technical market code. Because again, I don't think gamification is just about technology. It's actually about the introduction of market logic very often into our motivation. If you listen to guys from Silicon Valley, they'll tell you that there is no difference. They are essentially the same modes of regulating behavior. That it doesn't matter whether you rely on gamification or whether you rely on laws or whether you rely on norms, because ultimately all that matters is cost and efficiency. If those solutions will be cheaper and if they get more citizens to perform what is expected of them, that's all that matters. That, of course, is not the case, precisely because I would argue by changing the type of motivation that you're using, you're also producing different subjects. Right? To me, it's obvious that the person who obviously and regularly thinks of his civic duties and of some kind of citizenship and thinks about what it's like to live with others, if those behaviors are more or less, regular and in some sense, they are not singular, then you would come up with a very different attitude towards the market, the state, sociality, your fellow beings, and so forth. If you're continuously being appealed to through market logic, rewards, points, you name it, it's not obvious to me that you will still continue performing that behavior once you withdraw the rewards, right? And that's the more disturbing part, because once you kind of generate political subjects, i.e. citizens, who only think in that paradigm of rewards, points, recognition, currencies being given and paid for their behavior, then of course, then you have to introduce those incentives into all domains of everyday life, where previously you relied on the somewhat different motivation. You can actually have empirical studies that prove that show that changing from one type of motivation to another will have that kind of effect, right? I think we just have to understand that it's, again, gamification, sensors, algorithms, those are just one of the many ways in which technology essentially prolongs the viability of our current political system while radically transforming its content, moving it away from a far more, I would argue, democratic and political, and by political I mean that we're actually asking questions, who causes what problems and how do we solve them? That's what I mean by political. So we're moving away from that mode to a mode that looks much uglier. And I think the last frontier of this in our everyday life would be the question of what is going to happen to our personal data. And here I don't mean just the usual perspective on those things we hear from privacy activists, Edward Snowden, and that crowd that does extremely important work, which I do not mean to disparage in any way. There is, however, another dimension to this increased datification of our lives. And that dimension has to do with the fact that both governments and companies and increasingly citizens have realized that that data has monetary value, or at least that it can be put on the market and there is money to be made from it, right? And what I mean by this is that it has become obvious that the reason why Google can produce a service like Google Now is because ultimately it draws on all of the data that we have left at its servers. You take away my search data, my email data, my geo data from Google, and Google will not be able to do the kind of predictions that it does with Google Now, right? You take a lot of other kinds of data from Google, and it will not be able to do the kind of personalization of search results that it does. It will not be able to sell advertising the way it does. The entire business models right now operate on essentially claiming that we should leave our data with these giant companies because these giant companies are going to produce extra benefits to us, the users, right? That's one perspective. Another perspective comes from a different wing of Silicon Valley, and those are smaller startups that essentially argue that if only we would let them store our data, they would find even better advertisers, and they would actually share the proceeds with us. So we ourselves can become data entrepreneurs. We can actually make money, we can put our data up in the cloud, and then we would be paid on everything that we do, because everything that we do will be monitored, stored, and uploaded to the cloud based on whoever accesses that data, they'll essentially have to pay a fee. That fee will be shared with us, right? That's a second kind of solution to the data question. And then you have governments who, by the way, have also recognized that all this data has a value, and the governments themselves are sitting on lots of it, and perhaps given that they are facing a tremendous economic and fiscal crisis, and given that they have already privatized almost everything they could have privatized, data is the next obvious frontier. So what they're doing is trying to, for example, if you look at Britain, they're trying to sell off patient data from the National Health Service. They're trying to sell off student data that was gathered while students were applying to universities. And what I mean by sell is that they share it with advertisers. They share it with mobile networks. They share it with companies manufacturing soft juices and soft drinks and so forth, right? Again, it's an effort to generate some money, right, based on the data that the state has accumulated. So we find ourselves in this very bizarre situation where our choice is between one type of extreme neoliberalism where you have 2 or 3 giant corporations that are monopolists that are telling us that we should keep our data with them, because if we take our data from them, they are going to deliver an inferior service. You have a bunch of entrepreneurs who are telling us that we should record everything about our own life and trade this data, because it's a way to make money, and who doesn't want to make money now, given that real incomes are stagnating and people actually would want to have some money, given that we are living under a financial crisis, right? It's a very appealing proposition. And then you have governments who, for themselves, are trying to do something with that data, again, understanding that they need this cash to fill the gaps in their budgets, right? And you can clearly see how all 3 of these actors are basically trying to use data as a way to deal with a crisis of sorts, right? And they are all kind of convincing us that data is an asset, right? Data is a commodity. It has already been privatized. It already should be treated that way. There is no way back. There is no way out,